Shut up and sit down.
Hey everybody. Welcome to another episode of 2020 National Electrical Code Explained. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host as always. On today's episode, we are going to talk about what has changed in 210.8a. And the reason I wanted to do this video and kind of make it available to the public rather than share it only in my Patreon site is because I've been seeing a lot of educators online, people teaching the changes to the 2020 National Electrical Code, or people talking about it inside of podcasts and things like that have been sharing some kind of misleading information. They don't know all the details. And so at the end of the day, I thought it'd be a great video in order for me to be able to share 210.8a in this episode of the National Electrical Code, and then talk about the changes that are incorporated in it as I present the 2020 change. So let's look at the National Electrical Code and kind of wrap our head around what we're doing here. Okay, so as you can see right here on the screen, we're going to be talking about 210.8 for the 2020 edition. And I explain it a little bit, and we'll go over what it means when it comes to 210.8a. Now remember, 210.8a is specifically for dwelling units. We obviously have a B, a C, a D, an E, and an F, okay? Very independent of themselves, but what we're going to focus on this episode is 210.8a, and that is dealing with dwelling units in the significance of not only the change, but to really just talk about what took place here in the 2020 edition. So kind of read from the top here. We're talking about 210.8 in general. That's for ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel. Now, when we're dealing with 210.8a, which is dwelling units, we're very much dealing with receptacle applications. So that's the first thing to remember, because as you get into C and D and E and F and things like that, we kind of move out of the realm of just not talking only about receptacles, whereas 210.8a, it is very much specific about receptacles in this application. So kind of wanting to keep that so that we're all on the same playing field when we're discussing 210.8. Now, as I read the code, it says, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel shall be provided as required in 210.8a through F. So F is new, okay, for the 2020 NEC. Of course, we'll cover that more extensively over in our Patreon series, where I'm talking about all things National Electrical Code 2020 edition as we slowly move through that. So those of you who subscribe to that, it's a monthly contribution. It can be as low as $5. Doesn't have to be $20, the VIP. You can get access to all these videos for the $5 commitment. And what it does is you get to see every month we'll upload a couple videos and move you slowly through understanding the 2020 National Electrical Code. Okay? All right, anyway. So it says the ground fault circuit interrupter shall be installed in a readily accessible location. Okay, so where this rule is requiring a GFCI device, it will have to be obviously in a readily accessible location, which is a big difference from just an accessible location. Okay, accessible location means that you can get to it. It's not really anything's really obstructing it. Nothing special, right? We have definitions for all this. But when it requires something to be readily accessible, it has to be able to be approached without climbing over or under an obstruction. Okay, the ability to get to it without any special tools, things like that, or any tools in general. And a key is not considered a tool. So even a panel with a key on it is still considered readily accessible because it has ready accessibility to the individuals who need to have ready access to it. Okay, and then there's some people that ready access is not necessary, and so it figures all those things into account. Now, of course, we have some informational notes here that are just really, really good informational notes. They're going to remind you about the 215.9, which is the GFCI protection for personnel that can be applied for feeders. You'll also note that a lot of things as you learn 210.8, that, for example, used to have 210.8D, which dealt with a residential dishwasher, has now been moved. Okay, and so the movement of that moves that up into 422 for appliances. But the significance behind that change is it now applies broadly to all dishwashers. It no longer just applies to residential dishwashers. So that is a significant change for the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code. All right, so next thing you see here on the screen is the grayed out information. This is new material that has been added to the 2020 edition. Again, these are informational notes. So again, they're explanatory. They're just good information. They're not enforceable by any means by jurisdiction, but they do give you some nice informational guidelines and guideways into other areas of the National Electrical Code. And sometimes that can be extremely important. This document can sometimes be pretty difficult to understand. So having all of these little roadmaps, if you will, in order to be able to give you some hints and some information, in many cases, very valuable information. That's what informational notes are about. So just remember, you have notes in the code, which are very much applicable to maybe some tables, but then you have informational notes, and that's exactly what it is, informational, okay? Good knowledge. Now you notice here the two informational notes say C555.9 for GFCI requirements for boat hoists, okay? So that has been moved out of 210.8 and is now firmly planted up in 555 where it needs to be for marinas, and that's where you get the requirements for boat hoists at that location, okay? No longer will get that information here. The next thing is informational note number 4. It says additional GFCI requirements. We're right here. For specific circuits and requirements, equipment are contained in chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, that is a great statement because it reminds you that you have other applications. For example, receptacles up in Article 680. And you'll have it distances from pools and hot tubs, and all these requirements are in addition to what you're going to have required here in 210.8. Now, of course, today's lesson, we're going to be talking about dwelling units in A, but again, it's important to understand that 210.8 is the charging statement for the entire scope of A through F. Okay, so we're just kind of mentioning it so that you understand it as you move forward in your journey to learn the National Electrical Code. But you could have some applications again in Chapter 4, Chapter 5, and Chapter 6 that would require GFCI protection. And again, we understand that those are in addition to what will be required here under 210.8. Okay. Now, it goes on to also give us some guidelines for measurement. And this has kind of changed a little bit through the last couple cycles. Back in the 2014 code, you had this issue where you couldn't pass through. If you had a doorway, you had to forget the doorway was even there. The measurement would continue through the doorway, for example, or a door. In the 2017 code, that disappeared. Means the door actually broke the measurement. So if you're measuring from the sink to a receptacle under the counter, if it was behind a cabinet door, the measurement stopped at the door. Well, for the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code, that has changed back to the way it was kinda in the 2014 code. Means that measurement does not stop at a doorway or door, okay? So here's what it says. It says, for the purpose of this section, and again, this section being 210.8 is what this section is referring to. It says, when determining the distance from receptacles, okay, the distance shall be measured as the shortest path that the supply cord of an appliance connected to the receptacle would follow without piercing a floor, a wall, a ceiling, or fixed barrier, or the shortest path without passing through a window, okay? So, if I'm measuring and I have a receptacle, let's say in a bathroom, and the door is right there, and I have a receptacle that's serving the countertop for the bathroom, right? But right around the corner is into the bedroom, and I have a receptacle that's right there on the wall. And maybe it's a foot or two from the edge of the door once you in the bedroom, but it is within 6 feet, for say, within the top inside edge of the sink that's just around the other corner, then guess what? It's going to need to be GFCI protection. And that doorway used to be a barrier that would break that measurement, is no longer a barrier anymore. Okay. The same rule would be, for example, now a receptacle that's under the sink for the kitchen. The measurement from the top inside edge to that receptacle, the doorway or the door on the cabinet no longer breaks that measurement. You just forget it's even there and you measure onto the actual receptacle. So that is a significant change for the 2020 NEC that I just figured I'd throw out there as we're working through 210.8a. All right, so as you see on the screen, we're going to be talking about 210.8a. We're going to be specifically dealing with dwelling units. It's also important to understand that we're not just talking about single-family dwellings here. It's a dwelling unit, okay? So if you have a multi-family building that has individual dwelling units, then 210.8a is very much going to apply, okay? So it's not just single-family dwelling applications like a house, okay? It can also apply to any type of dwelling unit, whether it's two-family, one-family, whether it's a multi-family. We have a definition of what a dwelling unit is. And by the nature of that definition, cooking, sleeping, sanitation, and living, if it qualifies as a dwelling unit, then these rules are going to be in play. So let's read it now. And this is significant because in the 2017 code, there was a threshold between 15, whether it's 15 or 20 amperes, either or, and that's going to kick in the GFCI requirement. Well, in the 2020 code, you will notice that the 15 or 20 ampacity threshold is no longer available anymore. It is simply based on voltage of the device. So let's read it. It says, all 125 volt through 250 volt receptacles installed in the locations. Okay, so remember, we're going to talk locations, okay? Installed in the locations specified in 210.A1 through 811, 210.8A1 through A11, and supplied by single-phase branch circuits rated 150 volts or less to ground shall be ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel, okay? So we are very much talking about 125 volt receptacles are your normal 15, 20 amp receptacles. They're usually going to be 125 volt. But again, what we're encompassing here is even those 30 amp receptacles, okay? Even those 50 amp receptacles, okay, are encompassing this application here, all right? Now, when we say 150 volts to ground or less, remember, a 250 volt application really is dealing with a 240 volt circuit. And of course, 240 volt circuit, one of the legs to ground is 120 volts. So it's obviously less than 150 volts. So it encompasses all of those aspects of your installation. At 12208, for example, it's still 120 to ground, okay? And so, but even the receptacle itself in this application is, again, 250 volt receptacles, unless all the way down to 125 volt receptacles. That is the range we're dealing with. All right, so let's look at what we've got to work with here. So number one, that did not change, bathrooms. So any receptacle that meets this requirement that's located in a bathroom is going to have to be GFCI protected. Now we have a change that took place in the 2020 code that says, you know what, you can have other circuits in that bathroom, and they don't have to be 20 ampere rated. They could be 15 ampere rated. Maybe there's for a little plug-in for a bidet or something like that. I don't know how those work, but it could be something, there's a heater on it. Maybe it's a heater toilet. I don't know. That's okay. Previously, it was assumed that everything in the actual bathroom under 210.11 had to be 20 amperes. Well, we clarified that in the 2020 NEC. But what I need you to know is that any of the receptacles that fall under the scope of what we just read, again, 125 through 250, where one leg is 150 volts or to less to ground, is going to require the GFCI protection, okay? And again, in a 208 system or a 250 volt receptacle, one of those legs are definitely going to be to ground, is going to be 150 volts or less, okay? It's a no-brainer with that. So again, we're very detailed in dwellings, and we're very much held to what's called single-phase branch circuits in our applications right here, right? Now, the next one is obviously item number 2, and that is garages and also accessory buildings that have a floor located at or below grade level, not intended as habitable rooms and limited to storage areas, work areas, and areas of similar use. So this is really any type of accessory garage, maybe Cheryl's she shed, if you will, or something like that that could be considered an accessory building to the dwelling. So it's an accessory to the dwelling unit, but it could also be the garage as well, whether it's detached or detached as an accessory building, provided there's actual power there. Okay, got to have power there for these requirements to kick in for a detached garage. At the end of the day, if you have receptacles in there, because that's what we're talking about, receptacles, they're going to be GFCI protected, whether they're at floor level or even at below grade level. They're going to have GFCI protection. Okay. The next requirement is 3, which is outdoors. Now, there's an exception to this, but in general, any receptacle that falls under the scope here, remember, let's not use sight of what the scope is, 125 volt through 250 volt receptacle ratings, and as long as it's single phase and it has 150 volts or less to ground, okay, that's usually going to be one of the legs to ground, then what happens with that is outdoor receptacles are going to have to be GFCI protected. Now, what you do have an exception to 3, and the exception says receptacles that are not readily accessible and are supplied by branch circuits dedicated to snow melting, de-icing, or pipeline or vessel heating equipment shall be permitted to be installed in accordance with 426.28 or 427.22 as applicable. Okay, so what is that talking about? Well, if you go to 426.28, you'll notice that it says, like it on the screen here, it says, ground fault protection of equipment shall be provided for fixed outdoor electrical icing and snow melting equipment. Okay, but it's not necessarily the same level of protection as we would have with the GFCI for personnel. Okay, and this is the example of 427.22, which says ground fault protection. Okay, this is ground fault protection, not ground fault circuit interrupters. Okay, shall be provided for electric trace heating and electric panels. The requirement shall not apply to industrial establishments and blah, 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 blah. So you see the point in difference here. I'll go back here and you see ground fault protection, okay, is different at a higher threshold level than what GFCI protection would be, which is a 5 milliamps nominal value. Okay, so there's slightly difference in the requirement there. As you can see, this is ground fault circuit interrupters for protection for personnel. Okay, so don't have to be GFCI devices, but they have their own requirements for GFP, ground fault protection as well, that's covered in those other areas. And that is very specific to those types of receptacles. Any other receptacle outside, it falls into our scope here of the range we're talking about. It's going to be GFCI protected. Okay. The next one is item 4, and that is crawl spaces at or below level. Now, obviously, the crawl spaces that are entry is right at ground level or that drops down below level. Inside of there, any receptacles in there are going to have to be GFCI protected. Of course, we also know that the 2017 code implemented a requirement for lighting outlets inside a crawl space to also be GFCI protected as well. Okay, so this should be a no-brainer because we're all used to it. As well, when you're crawling in those spaces, there was a couple years ago, there was reported deaths of people, and it still happens as you're climbing over crap that's in the crawl space. So again, we're trying our best to protect people as they interact with receptacles, and of course now lighting outlets that are also located in a crawl space is required for GFCI. The next one is number 5. Now, number 5 is a significant change for the 2020 edition. Used to be unfinished portions of basements. Now the rule is all basements. So it doesn't matter whether it's finished or it doesn't matter whether it's unfinished. Okay, it's going to require that any receptacles that get placed in those locations to be GFCI protected. Now the other significance of this is that many cases in basements you'll have things like washing machines, dryers. You'll have other appliances, things that are down there, and they're going to require the GFCI protection. Even things like a sump pump for example, because there's no relief for that. Now, jurisdictions make rules, they change rules, they amend rules all over the country, but these are the general rules of the National Electrical Code. And so we tend to have to follow them unless a locality amends something or changes something in their process. So again, basements, finished or unfinished, doesn't really matter anymore. For the 2020 NEC, all receptacles are going to be GFCI protected. Okay. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and this rule really hasn't changed from what it was previously. Basically, it says exception to number 5 is a receptacle supplying only a permanently installed fire alarm or burglar alarm system shall not be required to have ground fault circuit interrupter protection. And of course, it has an informational note that sends you to 760 for fire alarms. Interesting enough, you don't see many fire alarms systems in dwelling units that often. Okay, you might see the burglar alarm, but not so much the fire alarm systems. Okay, but when we talk about you see smoke alarms, and the smoke alarms are generally normal smoke alarms, and they are going to, that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, this is an actual permanently installed fire alarm or burglar alarm system. So if your burglar alarm's down there, then you can actually, and notice it says a receptacle. When we say a receptacle, we're simply meaning if you use this or utilize this rule, we're talking about a single receptacle, like a simplex receptacle. I don't necessarily believe this would be a duplex receptacle, okay? Because it would say receptacles supplying only, and if I saw the plural, that would mean more than one. And I think we know that because we're going to get to number 6 here, and we see the use of that pluralness to receptacles, and we get the deal, okay? So this is a case where you do have an exception, probably not going to come up that often. If I'm instructing electricians moving forward, I'm just like, just put it all on GFCI, don't worry about it. But if you have a permanently installed fire alarm, it could happen, and you have a permanently installed burglar alarm, well, then you have an allowance not to do this. Now, most often than not, what's going to happen is these are probably going to be hardwired systems, so it really wouldn't be a plug unless you bought this aftermarket type of burglar alarm or fire alarm, and then I'm not so sure that would apply because that wouldn't qualify as a permanently installed system, okay? But again, be careful. Just telling you what the code says, okay? Now, it also says, it reminds us right here, we're talking about basements still. It says receptacles installed under the exception to 210.8A5, which we just finished talking about, shall not be considered as meeting the requirements of 210.52G, which is the requirement for the receptacle to be in the basement, okay? At least one. All right, so this does not, by putting that in there, is not to meet that requirement. This exception is in the additional receptacle, which doesn't have to be on GFCI for a permanently installed fire alarm or burglar alarm. It's not getting you out of the other required receptacles that are necessary to meet 210.52G. Okay, so it's just making a reminding statement. Okay, even though you put that one in there, you can't use that one to say I don't need any other ones to meet any of the other rules. This is only the exception to that single receptacle under this specific incident. Okay, so that's why they just wanted to put that notice in there to make it very clear. You still got other rules that are going to require general purpose receptacles down there. Okay, all right, the next thing we're looking at is kitchens. Not a change. We have a definition for what kitchen is. Interesting enough, in the 2020 code, we now have the definitions have changed when it comes to kitchens because we have other spaces that are similar to kitchens that are now going to require you to have that additional GFCI protection, but not when it comes to single family dwellings or dwelling units in general. That's going to be in other than dwelling units. And we're starting to see that expansion where it talks about kitchens, but you have other areas in buildings that maybe don't qualify as a kitchen, but they do have provisions that are permanent for food or even food preparation or cooking. So again, we have to look at the safety of that aspect, but that's dealing with other than dwellings. And of course, we said today, we're just going to deal with dwelling units, but I just wanted to give you a hint. That's coming up when it gets to other than dwelling units, and we'll talk about that when we get to 210.8B, other than dwelling unit applications. So sinks, this is where the receptacles are installed to serve the countertop surface. So this is a kitchen requirement, And it only serves the kitchen receptacles that are serving the countertop surfaces. Those have to be GFCI protected. We're all familiar with that, okay? A lot of people don't understand that I can have a refrigerator, which is generally required by the code to be on one of the small appliance branch circuits. However, it has an allowance or an exception to let it be its own separate branch circuit, and it could be as low as 15 amperes if it wanted to be, okay? And it's not just refrigerators, okay? It is now broader than just refrigerators. But the point is, that is many times people will feed the refrigerator and then jump up to the countertop and put the GFCI receptacle on the countertop, and now everything downstream is protected. And they think that they're not allowed to put the refrigerator on that small appliance branch circuit, when in reality, that's what the code starts out telling you can do and requiring you do that. And then it gives you an exception to say, well, if you want to run a dedicated circuit, you can, go for it. But most of the time, we're going to put our refrigerators on the small appliance branch circuit. It's so intermittent used that it really doesn't present a problem. And that's why you're required to have a minimum of 2 anyway, serving the countertop spaces, okay? So anyway, so those are going to be required to be GFCI protected, not the receptacles that don't serve the countertop, okay? Important things to remember when you're laying out your kitchen. Now, let's go on to sinks. Now, item number 7 is sinks. And we're not just talking about kitchen sinks, okay? We're talking about any sink in a dwelling unit. And it says, where receptacles are installed within 6 feet from the top inside edge of the bowl of the sink. Now remember earlier we said how you measure that? So again, from the top inside edge, it measures out 6 feet. So let's talk about the receptacle that's under the sink in the kitchen. Well, obviously the ones serving the countertop are GFCI protected, but what about that receptacle down there? Well, in this case, the door no longer breaks the measurement, so you literally would measure from the top inside edge to that receptacle. If that receptacle falls under the scope of 125 through 250, which it certainly will, then what happens is it has to be GFCI protected. Now, of course, the arguments always come into play. Is that receptacle underneath the sink readily accessible? In other words, can I put the GFCI device right there? Okay, that gets into a really hot contested debate because it really depends on where you put it in there. If it's being blocked by plumbing, because remember, what's the rules? It has to be readily accessible. So many people have argued that readily accessible might be great for somebody that's agile that can get under there. And then again, an 80, 85-year-old cannot readily get to it in that location to test it monthly like we all know you should test them. And so what happens is it really readily accessible? Is it much easier to just simply put the GFCI device in the panel, or maybe do a feed-through device on the counter and feed through it to feed that receptacle? Again, that's something you're going to have to work out in the design, and you're going to have to work out that with your local AHJ. If I gave my opinion, I do not think receptacles under the sink are readily accessible because of the crap that goes down there and usually by placement. Again, that's just my opinion. You can agree to disagree, but I'm never going to put the GFCI device down there because I don't think people know to reset it, and it's much harder to get to it to reset it and test it on a regular basis. Again, you can interpret that any way you want. Again, that's the beauty of the code. The AHJ will make the final decision. On paper, it probably would be still considered readily accessible. But again, you have to look at the definition, apply it to your unique situation, and then kind of move from there. I can't do that for you. Okay? You can certainly agree to disagree. And that's okay. The next one is, and this would apply to any sink, mind you, in the entire dwelling unit. Okay? Number 8, boathouses. Okay? So receptacles that are located in boathouses are going to have to be GFCI protected. Doesn't give us any parameters otherwise. It just literally makes a statement. All 125 through 250 volt receptacles that are 150 volts or less to ground are going to have to be GFCI protected in a boathouse, period. The next one is item number 9, which is bathtubs and shower stalls. Now, layouts in dwelling units can be quite interesting when it comes to bathrooms, and then of course you have other spaces that don't necessarily qualify as a bathroom. So to be a bathroom, by definition, you have to have at least a sink or a basin, and then any of the other types of toiletry items or utility items that would be normally in a bathroom, like a bidet, a urinal, a toilet, a bathtub, all these type of things. So sometimes you have these spaces that are split up that really don't have all the elements to be considered a bathroom. But yet you still have a hazard there. You still have water on the floor. You still have close proximity to all this type of things. And so we have to raise the level of caution here. So we have what's called bathtubs or shower stalls. Now, a house that I used to live in, literally the actual bathtub and shower combo was literally in like another room. It was kind of an offset. And the issue, one side, the bathroom was on one side. Then you had your bedroom, and then you had another one on the other side that had the shower and bathtub. It was very much not a bathroom over here, but there was a bathroom on the other side. The hazard still exists over here at the bathtub and shower area. So the advent of this code requirement was to treat it just like you would from a sink, theoretically. And it says, where receptacles are installed within 6 feet of the outside, okay, so used to be with the sink, it was the top inside edge. So with the shower stall and bathtub, it is within 6 feet of the outside edge of the bathtub or shower stall that you would start that measurement. Okay, and again, we saw earlier it's the measurement, and again, doors don't stop it, and doorways don't stop that measurement. Okay, so that's the requirement for needing to have the GFCI in those areas that have a bathtub or shower stall that not necessarily be a bathroom. Now, we have exceptions down here that are general exceptions, and they are exceptions to 1 through 3, which in our case was the bathrooms, and that was the garage and accessory building and the outdoors. Okay, so we have an exception that I'm going to read. It also applies to 5 through 8, so obviously it doesn't apply to crawl spaces, but it applies to bathrooms, and it applies to kitchens, it applies to sinks, and it applies to boathouses. Okay, and obviously it doesn't apply to 9, but it also applies to 10, which is laundry areas. So again, this seems like it's not going to touch the crawl space, doesn't want anything to do with that, and it's not going to have anything to do with the bathtubs and shower stalls. Okay, anything to do with that one. Okay, so what is this all about? It says, oh, and we should probably just cover, I guess before we even get to the exception, we should probably, I kind of overlooked item number 10 here, and that is laundry area. So laundry areas are going to have GFCI protection. Now, not just on the laundry circuit, for those receptacles that are in the area, and a couple cycles ago, it used to be triggered on whether or not we had a sink in the laundry room or laundry area. That was removed. So if it's a laundry area, it's going to require this GFCI protection. What's interesting is this is also going to require that the dryer be GFCI protected if you have a dryer in this laundry area. Of course, if you have the dryer in the basement, then it's going to be required to be GFCI protected as well, because it's going to fall under the scope of the 125 volt through 250. Okay, and I think that it'll work just fine, and you're not going to have in it. If it trips a GFCI, typically what it means is that we have appliance or a piece of equipment that's actually leaking more current than it should be. Okay, and so that GFCI is actually functioning as it should, and there's a problem that needs to be addressed. Okay, granted, we're getting a lot of expansion of GFCI devices, and I don't see them stopping anytime soon. They do save lives, and they are cheap insurance, if you will. And so again, I have no problem with their expansion. It's just it's a product of safety as we move forward, and more conscious of safe conditions, and the fact that we're trying our best, believe it or not, to protect people from themselves the best we possibly can. Okay, and some people don't like that. Some people believe in the Darwin theorism, whereas they actually survival of the fittest, and the dumbest don't survive. I I don't think the NEC buys into that theory. So, so we're trying our best to save people from themselves as they come in contact with electricity on a daily basis. Now let's talk about this exception again. It says, and again, it was exception to 1 through 3. So that's 1, 2, and 3. It's exception to 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's not touching the crawl space requirement. And of course, it picks up in the item 10, which is the laundry area. Okay. And what is it? It says, listed locking support and mounting receptacles utilized in combination with compatible attachment fittings, which, by the way, we got a definition of what attachment fitting is in the 2020 NEC, installed for the purpose of serving a ceiling luminaire or ceiling fan, shall not be required to be ground fault circuit interrupter protected if the general purpose convenient receptacle is integral to the ceiling luminaire or ceiling fan. GFCI protections shall be provided. Okay, so let's talk about this one. Now, this is originally what we're talking about is a specific type of male versus and female receptacle combination. And we had a change in the definition of what a receptacle was in the 2020 code, as well as it changed in the 2017 code. But we had the advent of what's called an attachment fitting definition. Basically, you've probably seen it. It's a device that will mount on the luminaire or fan. That is the attachment fitting. And then it has the female portion that actually mounts up in the light box, ceiling box, or whatever, fan box, and it will mate with the attachment fitting, and it has a connection that supports the weight, and basically it has round prongs, and it has the female end and the male end, and they interconnect, and that makes the connection, and it's designed to support the weight. That is a receptacle by definition, but it is not one of the ones that's intended for you to be able to plug things in like shavers or anything like that, a hair blower. So it doesn't necessarily need that protection. However, if I do have a luminaire in that bathroom or in these areas that we're talking about here, and it actually has a receptacle that's built on the luminaire, okay, or built on the ceiling fan, and I don't know why one would be on the ceiling fan, but let's say it was built in, then you could actually circumvent that connection, and you still have a receptacle that somebody could plug into, and there could be a hazard. So all this is saying is, if you're just doing a light, or you're doing a ceiling fan, and you're using this new type of mating system, that receptacle, which is still a receptacle, it's just not like the normal receptacles that we use, that right there does not have to be GFCI protected, okay? But if there's a receptacle that's integral to the luminaire or the ceiling fan that somebody could conceivably plug something into, then the GFCI protection requirement comes back in and says, forget the exception, you're going to protect it from GFCI. And at that point, you're probably going to have to do it all the way back at the panel because that's probably on the lighting circuit as well in there. So again, things to think about. But that is a lighting circuit, but that's a receptacle that you're installing in there as part of that combinations fitting. And that's what kicks this rule in. All right. So this is all about receptacles. Okay. Now, last but not least, item 11, which is new for the 2020, and that is indoor damp and wet locations. Okay, so we had indoor wet locations, but we really didn't have indoor damp locations. So we want to cover indoor damp and wet locations. Now, what could this be? Well, there's plenty of areas that we do, like some of the upscale homes have actually entrances into what's called a dog wash area. And it is all tiled with a drain in the floor. Literally, that is a damp or wet location. And so any receptacles that are in there, because people plug in blow dryers and things like that, power dryers, they have to be treated as if it's a damp or wet location, and it's going to need GFCI protection. So any of that. Now, some of the educators around the country are showing pictures and things like mud rooms, for example, which they were never required in the past to be GFCI protected in there. In fact, they're not really considered habitable rooms, so they didn't even require receptacle placements in there in accordance with 210.52, to be honest with you. Okay, and so it wasn't until a couple of cycles ago that we even addressed foyers, for example, when it comes to required receptacles. So at the end of the day, a mud room is, to me, is not necessarily a wet or a damp location. But some people, depending on what's in there, and the ability or the propensity for moisture to be sprayed or sprayer or whatever might jump out and say, this has to be considered a damp or wet location, and I'm going to require GFCI protection. The answer to this is, if in doubt, GFCI it, okay? Because that's where we're going with most things. So again, look at the situation. You're going to have to make that call. I can't make it for you. Every situation is uniquely different. Every room is uniquely different. Have a good dialogue and communication with your electrical inspector. See what you can do, what you can't do. Remember, it's very simple to put a GFCI device in there, not overly expensive, and you can meet the code. Maybe you don't put it in there because you don't know that that's a damp or wet location, or you don't think it is. And then an inspector says, yes, it's got to be. Okay. Just put a GFCI device in there. Lesson learned, live and learn. Every job is different. But I just wanted you to make sure that you understand what you're dealing with when you have to make those kind of calls in those areas. Okay? So hopefully you got something out of today's lesson where we looked at 210.8a and kind of looked at the scope of what GFCI requirements are. You kind of understand now that the 15 and 20 amp threshold is gone. Okay? 125 through 250 volt rated receptacles. Okay? And where it was 150 volts or less to ground are going to require ground fault circuit interrupter protection in accordance with 210.8a. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.
And sit down.